The Arizona sun was a hammer, and the anvil was Clara Hawthorne's land. For 2 years, every day had been a fight against the dust. It coated her skin, settled in the lines around her eyes, and turned the water in the trough to sludge. Her ranch, if one could call it that, was just 200 acres of cracked earth and mesquite, bordered by rising red rock that held the heat long after dark. She was down to 9 head of cattle, ribs showing, their hides dull. Her hands were the landscape in miniature, cracked, dry, and scarred. The leather of her husband's old work gloves was splitting at the seams, and the skin beneath was raw. Clara drove the heel of her boot against the warped fence post, trying to wedge it deeper into the baked ground. It didn't budge. She grunted, shoving with her shoulder, the impact jarring the bones in her arm. Elias had set these posts, and like everything Elias had done, he had done it halfway, leaving her to fix the rot. He had been dead 2 years, and still, he was the heaviest thing she carried. Her loneliness was a physical presence. It sat across from her at the small kitchen table. It lay beside her in the narrow cot she'd dragged into the parlor, unable to face the big bedroom, the heavy frame of the marital bed. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the dry wood walls and the skitter of a mouse. At night, the cold settled into her bones, a different kind of chill than the desert air. It was the cold of absence. The town of Red Cienega was only 5 miles east, but it felt 1,000 miles away. The folk there treated her with a careful, wide distance. When she rode in for flour and salt, conversation stopped. Mrs. Davies, the mercantile owner's wife, would busy herself rearranging tins, leaving Clara to wait. They all knew how Elias Hawthorne died. He'd been found at the bottom of a dry arroyo, his neck broken, his horse nowhere in sight. It was ruled an accident, a drunken fall on a dark night. But the whispers said otherwise. Elias had been a loud man, quick with his fists in the saloon and, though no one ever said it aloud, quick with his hand at home. The whispers said she had finally provoked him past reason, that maybe she had helped the fall along, that a woman who could not give her husband a child was a woman capable of anything. Clara had stopped listening. She just wanted to hold the land. It was all she had left. She gave up on the fence post, wiping the sweat from her brow with a dusty forearm. The sun was high. Thirst clawed at her throat. She headed back toward the cabin, a small, solid structure of timber that baked like an oven by noon. That was when she saw the rider. He was just a shimmer of heat and dust at first, moving slow. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. Strangers were seldom good news. They were either lost or they were trouble. She slipped inside the cabin, her hand going straight to the Winchester rifle resting by the door. She checked the load, her movements practiced and sure. She stood just inside the doorway, in the shade, watching him approach. He wasn't riding hard. He slumped in the saddle, and his horse looked half dead. As he drew closer, she saw the trail dust covering him like a second skin. His hat was pulled low, but she could see a dark beard, matted, and a face worn down by sun and wind. He stopped 10 yards from the porch, lifting a hand slowly. He didn't dismount. "Ma'am," his voice was rough, like gravel poured from a boot. "Just looking for water, for my horse, mostly." Clara remained in the shadow. "There's a trough by the barn. Don't let him drink too fast." The man nodded. He swung his leg over, his movement stiff. He was tall but lean, all bone and sinew. He led the horse to the trough, pumping the handle of the well. He let the horse drink, his hand stroking its neck, before cupping his own hands and drinking deep from the spout. He turned back to her, wiping his mouth on his sleeve. He stood there, waiting. He hadn't reached for a weapon. He hadn't made any move toward the house. "Much obliged," he said. Clara stepped halfway onto the porch, the rifle still held loose in her right hand. "Where you headed?" "Ain't particular." He looked at her ranch, his eyes taking in the broken fence, the sagging barn roof, the thin cattle. He didn't look at her with pity. He just looked. "You got work? I can fix that fence. Shore up the barn." Clara's jaw tightened. She needed help. She needed it desperately. But a man was a risk. A man was a mouth to feed. A presence. A danger. "I got no money to pay." He nodded, as if he expected it. "I ain't asking for wages, just food, a place to sleep. The barn's fine. I can move on in a week. Or whenever you say." His name, he said, was Wade Coulter. She studied him. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, and they held a deep weariness she recognized. He had scars, a thin white line that cut through his left eyebrow, and a deeper, uglier pucker of skin on his neck, just above his collar. He wasn't soft, but he didn't look cruel. He just looked done. "The barn is hot," she said, testing him. "Warmer than the ground, ma'am. Food is plain, beans and cornbread. It's food." Clara weighed the risk of the man against the certainty of the ranch failing. The ranch was losing. "The barn it is. You start on that fence line. I'll bring you supper when it's dark." She turned and went back inside, locking the door behind her. She watched him through the dusty window. Wade Coulter looked at the cabin door for a long moment, then turned, tied his horse, and walked directly to the broken fence line. He picked up the tools she had left and got to work. The tension in the air changed. Her isolation was broken, but the silence was now filled with something else, an awareness. For 3 days, they existed in this rhythm. Clara would rise before dawn, milk her one good cow, and leave a bucket of fresh milk and a hunk of cornbread by the barn door. He would be gone by the time the sun rose, already working. She watched him. He moved with a quiet efficiency. He didn't just fix the post she'd struggled with. He dug new holes, reset the worst of the line, and tightened the wire. He worked through the killing heat of the afternoon, stopping only for water. Clara found herself curious. He never spoke unless she spoke first. He was quiet, but he was always observing. One afternoon, she was trying to hoist a sack of feed, grunting with the effort, when he simply appeared at her side. He didn't ask. He just took the sack from her. The weight of it, 50 pounds, barely made him brace. "Where you want it?" he asked. "In the bin," she said, her voice tight. She was wary of his strength, wary of him seeing her weakness. He dumped the feed, and his eyes scanned the small barn. He saw the empty stalls, the worn-out harness, the single saddle. He saw the truth of her situation. He turned to her, his gaze steady. "You're doing all this alone," he said. It wasn't a question. "I manage." His eyes dropped to her hands, which she quickly hid in the folds of her skirt. He saw the toll. He saw the raw knuckles and the broken nails. He saw the exhaustion she tried to hide behind a stiff spine. And he saw something else, deeper, the hurt she carried, the permanent shadow in her eyes. He nodded once. "I'll fetch the water," he said, changing the subject, releasing her from his gaze. She was relieved, and, strangely, she was disappointed. She felt a prickle of interest, a small, forgotten curiosity about another human being. It was a dangerous feeling. On the 4th night, the sky turned a sick, greenish yellow. The air grew heavy and still. Wade was mending the latch on the stable door when Clara came out, carrying her rifle. "Storm's coming," she said. "A bad one. We need to get the cattle into the canyon." He just nodded, grabbing a rope. It hit them faster than they expected. The wind came first, a low howl that rose to a shriek, throwing grit and sand into their faces. They managed to push the terrified cattle into the narrow box canyon that offered some protection. But by the time they turned back, the world was obscured by a solid wall of dust. "To the cabin!" Clara yelled over the wind. The barn was closer, but she knew that roof. It wouldn't hold. They ran, heads down, the wind trying to tear them from their feet. A branch from the old cottonwood snapped and crashed behind them. Wade grabbed her arm, steadying her, and pulled her up the porch steps. They fell inside the cabin. Clara slamming the door against the howling wind and sliding the heavy bar into place. The cabin was instantly dark, the windows pelted with sand and debris. The sound was deafening. The wind hit the small house like a fist, and the walls groaned. "It'll hold," Clara said, mostly to herself. "It's solid," Wade agreed. They stood in the gloom, breathing hard, covered in dust. He was close, too close. She could smell the sweat and the trail on him. She moved away quickly, bumping into the table. "I'll light the fire," she said, her voice shaky. She knelt at the hearth, her hands trembling as she struck a match. The kindling caught, and the small flame threw dancing, nervous shadows across the room. Wade stayed by the door, as if not wanting to claim any territory. He took off his hat and beat the dust from it against his thigh. "That was close," he said. "It will pass by morning." The storm raged. It was impossible to speak over the sound. They were trapped. 2 people in one small room, the space shrinking with every minute. Clara busied herself, making a pot of coffee, needing the simple task to steady her nerves. She had not been alone in this house with a man since Elias. Wade eventually moved from the door, taking a seat on the small stool by the wall. He was respecting her space. He sat with his forearms on his knees, staring into the fire, saying nothing. The silence inside the cabin stretched, heavy and thick, punctuated by the roar of the wind. Clara felt his presence in every corner of the room. She was intensely aware of the way the firelight caught the planes of his face, the breadth of his shoulders under the dusty shirt. She poured the coffee into 2 tin mugs. Her hands were steady now. She walked over to him. "Coffee," she said. He looked up. His eyes met hers in the firelight. He reached out to take the mug. As he took it, his fingers, calloused and warm, brushed the back of her hand. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental touch. For Clara, it was a lightning strike. A jolt of pure, sharp heat shot up her arm, straight to her chest, making her gasp. She pulled her hand back as if she'd been burned, spilling a few drops of hot coffee on the floor. "Sorry," Wade said, his voice low. Clara couldn't speak. She stared at the spot on her hand where he had touched her, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer awkward. It was taut, charged, and suffocating. She could feel the heat in her face. Wade watched her. He saw her reaction, the sudden panic in her eyes, the way her breath caught. The touch, the closeness, the storm. It all conspired to break the dam she had built inside her mind. The memories she kept locked away rushed in, drowning her. She wasn't in the cabin with Wade Coulter. She was in the bedroom, the lantern turned down low. Elias was home from the saloon, smelling of whiskey and rage. He wasn't gentle. His touch was not a brush, it was a grip. His hands were heavy, bruising, demanding. He'd branded her with a fear so deep she thought it was part of her bone. He'd taught her that intimacy was pain, that a man's touch was a prelude to violation, a duty to be endured, a cold, cruel act meant to punish her for her barren womb. He would take her, rough and silent, and when he was done, he would roll over and say, "Useless." Clara shivered violently, the tin mug rattling in her hand. She wrapped her arms around herself, turning her face toward the fire, hiding the sudden terror. She felt Wade's eyes on her. She expected a question. She expected him to move closer, to press the advantage the sudden tension had created. That's what men did. But Wade Coulter did not move. He did not speak. He did not ask her what was wrong. He simply looked back at the fire, lifted his mug, and drank his coffee. He remained on his stool, 3 feet away, offering her a stillness that was more comforting than any word. He sensed her discomfort, the raw fear that had just surfaced, and he respected it. He asked nothing. He expected nothing. The storm howled outside, a wild and violent thing. Inside the small cabin, Another storm, quiet and just as powerful, had begun. Clara stayed by the fire, trembling, and Wade stayed by the wall, drinking his coffee. His presence a strange, new thing. It was not a threat, and that, more than anything, terrified her. The storm passed, leaving the air washed clean and the ground dark with precious moisture. The oppressive tension of that night in the cabin did not break, but it settled, changing the shape of their silence. Wade Coulter went back to his work, his movements as steady and quiet as before. But Clara Hawthorne found she could no longer just watch him. She watched him reset the last of the failed fence line, his back a long, hard line as he worked the post-hole digger, the muscles in his arms and shoulders moving with an economy of force. He worked like a man who had nothing left but work. He mended the barn roof, his hammer strokes even and sure. He fixed the wobbly back step to her porch. He asked for nothing, not even for the coffee she now brought him mid-morning. He was a presence, solid and unassuming, and in the bright, harsh light of the Arizona sun, the fear she'd felt during the storm began to feel misplaced. The memory of Elias, of hands that gripped and bruised, began to fade, replaced by the image of Wade's hand, calloused and large, resting on his own knee, just 3 feet from her. A week after the storm, Clara was checking the water level in the trough, the mid-afternoon sun beating on her shoulders, when she heard them. 2 riders, coming in too fast, laughing too loud. She didn't recognize the horses. Her hand went to the small pistol Elias had kept, the one she now wore tied to her skirt belt. She stepped back toward the cabin, her heart starting its familiar, panicked rhythm. They were Jed Miller and a hired hand she only knew as Smitty, both from the Bar T Ranch north of town. They were often drunk in red Cienega, and always trouble. "Well now, look at that," Jed called out, pulling his horse up so sharp it danced. He leered at her, his eyes thick and appreciative. "Ms. Hawthorne, all alone out here. It ain't right. A woman like you going to waste." "I'm busy, Mr. Miller," Clara said, her voice tight. She kept one hand on the porch rail, the other hidden in the folds of her skirt, gripping the pistol. "Oh, she's busy," Smitty cackled, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "We just came by to be neighborly. Heard you had a hard time after Elias fell." He said the word with a nasty emphasis. "A woman needs help, needs a strong hand." Jed swung down from his horse, his spurs jingling. He started toward the porch, untying his gun belt and letting it drop to the ground. "Just want to talk, ma'am. Maybe you could spare a drink for a thirsty neighbor." "I've got nothing for you," Clara said, taking a step back. "You need to leave my land." "Now, that ain't friendly." Jed put one boot on the bottom step. He was close enough now that she could smell the sour whiskey on his breath. "Elias wasn't friendly either. And look where he is. Maybe you just need someone to remind you how to be grateful." He lunged for the porch. Clara screamed, pulling the pistol, her hand shaking so badly she almost dropped it. "Get your boot off her step." The voice came from the corner of the barn. Wade Coulter stood there, hammer in hand. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't sound angry. He sounded as calm as if he were asking to pass the salt. Jed froze, his head snapping toward the sound. Smitty, still on his horse, reached for his sidearm. "I wouldn't," Wade said. He still hadn't moved. The hammer just rested, heavy, in his right hand. "Your friend on the horse. He draws. I'll put this through his skull before he clears leather. You," he looked at Jed. "You're already too close. You just need to decide if you want to leave walking." Jed Miller was bigger than Wade. He was drunk and mean, but he wasn't stupid. He saw the set of Wade's shoulders. He saw the scars on his face and neck. This was not a man who made idle threats. "Who the hell are you?" Jed snarled, but he took his foot off the step. "I'm the man fixing the fence," Wade said. "And you're the men kicking up dust. Get on your horses, ride out." "This is Hawthorne land," Jed blustered. She ain't got no—" "She's got me," Wade said. The words were flat, final. "Now!" A long, tense second passed. Jed stared at Wade, then at Clara. He saw the pistol in her trembling hand. He saw the utter lack of fear in Wade's pale eyes. He spat in the dust. "Come on, Smitty. The widow's got herself a guard dog." He backed away, scooped up his gun belt, and clumsily mounted his horse. "You'll regret this, Hawthorne. This is our valley." They wheeled their horses around and galloped off, leaving a cloud of dust and the stench of whiskey. Clara sank against the porch post, the pistol suddenly weighing 100 pounds. Her legs felt like water. She stared at the dust cloud, her breath coming in short, painful sobs. Wade didn't move until they were gone. He tossed the hammer lightly and caught it, then walked over, his boots sounding loud in the sudden quiet. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at her. He didn't look at her face, but at the pistol. "You should hold it steadier," he said, his voice quiet again. "Grip it like you mean it. A shaky hand gets a person killed." She looked at him, her eyes wide, tears streaking the dust on her cheeks. She couldn't find her voice. He nodded, once, as if to himself. "They won't be back, not while I'm here." He turned and walked back to the barn, picking up the piece of timber he'd been sawing. The sound of his work, steady and even, filled the air. That evening, the silence between them was deeper. Clara cooked her usual meal of beans and bacon, but she cooked more. She took a plate out to the barn. Wade was sitting on a hay bale, cleaning his saddle gear by the light of a single lantern. "I brought you supper," she said, her voice small. He stopped, looking at the plate. "Obliged." She didn't leave. She stood in the wide doorway of the barn, the cooling air pulling at her hair. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." He didn't look up, just kept working the oil into the leather. Men like that, they only understand one thing. They'll be back. They'll tell people in town. "Let 'em." Clara watched his hands. They were strong, steady. The same hands that had brushed hers in the dark. The same hands that had held a hammer like it was a weapon. "You're not afraid of them." He finally paused, looking at her. "I'm afraid of plenty, ma'am, just not of them." She stepped into the barn, the smell of hay and old leather wrapping around her. "Why did you help me?" "They were on your land. You told them to leave. They didn't listen." He shrugged, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. She sat on a different hay bale, a few feet away. The plate of food was between them. No one has stood up for me. Not since—" She trailed off. "Elias, he liked men like that. He was friends with them." Wade stopped his work. He picked up the plate and began to eat, his gaze on the far wall. "He was a cruel man, Elias," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. She hadn't said them aloud to another living soul. Everyone in town knew it, but they looked away. They said it was my fault." Wade ate slowly, listening. "They said I was a bad wife, that I couldn't give him children. The doctor in Tucson told me, years ago, something broken, something wrong inside. Elias, he told everyone. He told them I was barren. He said it made me bitter. He said it was why he drank. Why he—" She couldn't say the rest. "He used it," Clara continued, her voice gaining a thin, reedy strength. "He held it over me like a whip. He said it was God's punishment, that I was less than a woman, that I was useless." She looked down at her own scarred hands. "After 2 years, I'm almost starting to believe him. I feel empty, like I'm just a dry well." The barn was quiet, save for the sound of Wade's fork scraping the tin plate, when she finally risked a look at him. His face was hard, but not with anger at her. It was something else. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was just looking at her, seeing the whole sorry truth. He finished the last bean and set the plate down. "You ain't broken," he said, his voice rough. "And you ain't useless. You're just alone." He picked up the rag and the oil. "A man who'd do that to his wife, he ain't a man." "And you?" she asked, her curiosity suddenly sharp, desperate to know who this man was. "What about you, Wade Coulter? You're alone, too. You drift. Why?" He was silent for a long time, the only sound the slide of the rag on the leather. "I did something," he said finally, his voice low. "A long time ago, back in Texas, I was in a card game. Man accused me of cheating. He was wrong, but he was drunk. He pulled his gun. I was faster." He stopped, his hands still. "I killed him. It was self-defense. The sheriff knew it. The judge knew it. But the man I killed, he had family, rich family. They didn't see it that way. I spent a year in a cell before they let me go. But it didn't matter. The name stuck. Killer." He looked at his own hands. "I started drifting. Found work where I could. But a man's past, it follows you. A name like that. Settling down just means giving it a place to find you. It means looking at folks every day. Seeing 'em wonder. Seeing 'em judge. It's easier to keep moving." He looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting hers in the lantern light. "We all got things we're running from. Miss Hawthorne, you're running from what he did to you. I'm running from what I did." Clara stood up, her legs unsteady. The air in the barn was thick with their shared confessions. "Thank you," she said, "for the fence, and for Jed." "Get some sleep. Clara," he said, using her first name for the first time. It sounded strange and solid. She went back to the cabin, but she didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table, watching the moon rise over the rocks, thinking of a man who killed in self-defense and a woman who was accused of the same. That night, the house felt colder than ever. The next day passed in a haze. They worked. They did not speak of what was said in the barn, but the barrier between them was gone. The space between the cabin and the barn was no longer a border. It was just a stretch of dirt. That evening, Clara made stew. She used the last of her dried herbs. She made fresh biscuits. When it was ready, she found herself setting 2 plates at the small kitchen table. Wade came to the porch as the sun set, same as always, to get his plate. "Wade," she said, her voice quiet. He stopped, looking at her through the screen door. "Come inside," she said. It's too cold to eat out there." He hesitated. This was different. This was an invitation. He pulled open the door and stepped inside. The cabin was small, and he seemed to fill it. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands. He looked uncertain for the first time. "Sit," she said, motioning to the table. They ate in silence. It was a different silence than the one in the barn. It was charged with a nervous energy. Clara could barely swallow. She was aware of his knee, just inches from hers under the small table. She was aware of the sound of his breathing. When they finished, he stood. "That was good. Ma'am, thank you." "Clara," she said. "My name is Clara." He nodded. "Clara." He was about to turn to the door, to the safety of the barn. "Don't go," she said, the words rushing out. He stopped. He turned back to her, his face in shadow, the lamplight behind him. "Stay," she said. "Just sit by the fire." He looked at her, searching her face. He saw the desperation there, and the fear. He nodded slowly and moved to the stool he had occupied during the storm. Clara's hands were trembling. She went to the small cabinet where Elias had kept his whiskey. There was 1 bottle left, nearly full. She poured 2 glasses. Her hands were shaking so much the bottleneck rattled against the glass. She handed one to him. He took it, his fingers brushing hers. This time, she didn't pull away. The jolt was still there, but it wasn't fear. It was something else, something hot and aching. She sat in her rocking chair, across the hearth from him. He never wanted me to drink," she said, staring into the amber liquid. "He said it wasn't proper, but he drank enough for both of us." Wade said nothing. He just sipped the whiskey, his eyes on the fire. "I'm so tired, Wade," she whispered. "I'm so tired of being the widow Hawthorne. I'm tired of the whispers. I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of being cold." She looked at him, her heart hammering so hard she thought he must hear it. "I watch you. You're strong. You're kind. You don't look at me like I'm broken." "You ain't," he said, his voice a low rumble. She stood up. She set her glass down on the hearth. She walked the few feet that separated them and stood in front of him. He looked up, his face full of a deep, knowing sadness. "Clara," he said, a warning in his voice. She didn't listen. She reached out, her trembling hand touching his face, the rough stubble of his beard, the scar on his eyebrow. He closed his eyes at her touch, but he didn't move. She leaned down and kissed him. It was a clumsy, desperate kiss. It was all fear and chapped lips and the taste of whiskey. She pressed against him, not knowing what she was doing, only knowing she needed to be close to something warm. He stayed still for a second. Then his hands came up, not to pull her closer, but to grip her shoulders. He gently, firmly, pushed her back. He stood up, towering over her. His eyes were dark, pained. "Clara, don't!" Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sharp. Shame flooded her. "I'm sorry, I thought—" "You're scared," he said, his voice rough. "You're shaking like a leaf. This ain't what you want. You're just lonely." "No!" she cried, the word tearing from her throat. She grabbed the front of his shirt, her fists clenched. "That's not it. You don't understand. I want this. I'm scared because of him, because all I know is hurt." She looked up at him, the tears streaming down her face, her voice dropping to a ragged, desperate whisper. "Please, I want to feel something that doesn't hurt. I need to know. I need to know it's possible. Please, Wade." His face softened. The hardness was gone, replaced by a deep, aching tenderness. He looked at her, at the raw plea in her eyes, and saw not a woman he could take, but a woman who was begging to be given back to herself. He lifted one hand, his calloused thumb brushing the tear track on her cheek. "Clara," he breathed. He didn't kiss her mouth. He kissed her forehead, a simple, gentle press of his lips against her skin. Then he kissed her temple. He kissed the scar that Elias had left on her hairline. He was slow. His hands moved from her shoulders, one sliding around her back, the other cupping her face, his fingers threading into her hair. He held her. He just held her, letting her feel his warmth, his strength, letting her feel that he wasn't going to take, or demand, or bruise. She leaned into him, her breathing ragged. He guided her backward, slowly, toward the cot she kept in the parlor. He never broke the contact. He sat on the edge, pulling her down with him, so she was sitting beside him, her head tucked against his shoulder. "It's all right," he whispered against her hair. "It's all right. I'm here." She turned her face, pressing a kiss to his scarred neck. Don't be gentle," she whispered, a strange new urgency in her voice. "I mean, I don't—" "I know," he said. He kissed her then. His mouth was firm and warm and sure. It was not the clumsy, frightened kiss she had given him. It was a kiss that offered, that questioned, that waited. He let her lead. He let her part her lips. He let her hands explore his shoulders, his back, the hard muscle of his arms. His own hands were achingly slow. He undid the buttons of her dress, his fingers brushing her collarbone, and she flinched, but he didn't stop. He just paused, his lips moving to her neck, until her trembling eased. He pushed the rough fabric off her shoulders. He was responsive. Every time she tensed, he slowed. Every time she leaned into him, he met her, He was mapping her body not with lust, but with a kind of reverence. He was learning her, and in doing so, he was teaching her that her skin was not a thing to be hated. When they were finally bare, skin to skin in the firelight, he laid her back on the narrow cot. He looked at her, his eyes taking in her thinness, the old bruises that had faded to yellow shadows on her ribs, the map of her suffering, and he saw her. He was slow, he was tender, he was intense. He made her feel every inch of her own skin, not as a prison, but as a part of her. He taught her, wordlessly, the difference between taking and being given. When he finally entered her, she cried out, a small, sharp sound. It was the memory of pain. He stopped instantly. "Clara?" She opened her eyes, looking up at him. She saw the worry in his face, the immediate readiness to pull away. And in that moment, she knew this was real. "No," she whispered. "Don't stop. It's all right." He moved, slowly, watching her face, and the pain faded, replaced by a sensation so new, so overwhelming. It terrified her. It was a warmth, a building, a coiling. It was a feeling she had only ever read about, a thing she assumed was a lie told in books. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his back, as the feeling grew, sharp and bright and agonizingly good. It built until she thought she would break, and when it finally crested, she didn't just cry out. She screamed, a raw, keening sound of pure, unadulterated release. It broke her open. Afterward, as the cabin settled back into silence, as the fire died to embers, she began to sob. It wasn't a gentle weeping. It was a storm, a violent, ragged, broken-hearted storm that came from the deepest part of her. She wept for the years she had lost. She wept for the cruelty. She wept for the shame. She wept for the children she would never have. And she wept for the single, terrifying moment of release that had finally set her free. Wade didn't say a word. He didn't shush her. He didn't offer comfort. He just pulled her against his chest, wrapped his arms around her, and held her. He held her as she shook. He held her as she choked on her own grief. He was an anchor, a solid, warm presence in the wreckage. It was a long time before the sobs subsided into shudders. She lay limp in his arms, exhausted, empty, and new. She turned her head, her voice muffled against his chest. "I couldn't breathe," she whispered, her voice raw. He stroked her hair, his hand steady. "For all these years, Elias, he made me feel so small, so broken." She took a shaky, wet breath. "Tonight, I couldn't breathe. You hit the perfect spot." He knew she didn't just mean the physical. She meant the very center of her, the knot of pain and shame and grief he had just undone. Wade Coulter held her tighter. He looked over her head at the dying fire, at the moonlit square of the window. He thought of the long, dusty roads he had traveled, the running, the judgment, the cold ground. He felt the warmth of her skin, the dampness of her hair, the trusting, heavy weight of her body against his. He had meant to leave. He always meant to leave. But as Clara Hawthorne finally, truly slept in his arms, he made a silent vow. He would stay, for now. The sun rose different. When Clara woke, she was alone in the narrow cot, the scratchy wool blanket pulled up to her chin. For one sharp, cold second, she felt a hollow panic, the familiar emptiness of the morning after Elias, the feeling of being used and discarded. Then she smelled coffee. She sat up, her body aching in ways that were new, ways that were deep and good. Wade was at the hearth, his back to her, poking the fire. He had not left. He had not vanished like a dream. He was wearing his same dusty trousers, his shirt still unbuttoned. He was real. He heard the cot creak and turned. He didn't smile. Not really, but the lines around his eyes softened. He held the tin pot. "Coffee," he said. as if it were any other morning. He brought her a mug. Their fingers brushed as she took it, and this time she did not flinch. She held his gaze. The heat that shot up her arm was a steady, warming fire, not a lightning strike. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice rough with sleep. "I stayed," he confirmed. He took his own mug and went to the porch, sitting on the top step, looking out at the land. He was giving her space. Clara dressed behind the privacy screen, her hands moving over her own skin. She felt tender, rediscovered. The shame she expected to feel, the guilt that Elias had drilled into her, was absent. In its place was a quiet, fragile wonder. Their days found a new rhythm, one built on shared tasks and quiet understanding. Wade was no longer just a hired hand, and he was no longer sleeping in the barn. But by the time the sun rose high enough to be seen from the road, he was always outside, working. And she was in the cabin. They kept their secret. Red Cienega did not need to know. The whispers had quieted in the last 2 years. Clara had no intention of starting them again. Wade was a man who saw what needed fixing. He didn't just mend the fence, he rebuilt the entire sagging front porch. Elias had promised to fix that bottom step for 3 years, letting it rot until it was a hazard. Wade tore it out, found solid wood, and replaced it in an afternoon. His hammer blows were steady, a heartbeat for the silent ranch. He climbed onto the roof of the cabin, finding and patching the leaks they'd discovered during the storm. He rehung the barn door so it swung smooth and true. He was, piece by piece, repairing the decay that Elias had left behind. And as he fixed the ranch, he fixed her. He was a quiet man, but his presence was loud. He'd sit with her on the new porch as the sun went down, the heat bleeding from the sky, and they would talk. He spoke of the high plains in Wyoming, the color of the mountains in Colorado. She spoke of the books she used to read, the garden she'd tried to grow before the drought. One afternoon, while trying to pen a stubborn calf, the small creature bucked and kicked, sending Wade sideways into the dust. He sat there for a moment, covered in grime, and then he let out a low, dry chuckle. He looked at her, and she saw the laughter in his eyes. A sound bubbled up in Clara's chest, one she didn't recognize. It was a rusty, creaking noise that turned into a light, airy laugh. She clapped a hand over her mouth, shocked at the sound of it. Wade's expression softened. He didn't say anything, just stood, beat the dust from his hat, and said, "Stubborn little devil." But she saw the way he looked at her. He had heard it. He had given her back her own laughter. Their nights were a different kind of healing. In the darkness of the small cabin, with the lamp turned low, there was no fear. There was only touch. He was patient. He learned her body, and he taught her to trust it again. He taught her the difference between possession and partnership. He was a refuge from a world that had only ever offered her pain. But the world always found a way in. She went to town for supplies near the end of the month. She tied her horse outside the mercantile, her shoulders tight, bracing for the inevitable chill from Mrs. Davies. But this time, the chill was replaced by something else, a sharp, sudden silence, followed by excited whispers. A man was standing by the counter, talking to the sheriff. He was not a local. He was tall, dressed in a clean black duster, his boots polished. A silver badge, a star within a circle, was pinned to his vest. He was clean-shaven, with cold, dark eyes and a hard jaw. When Clara entered, he stopped talking and turned his head. His eyes raked over her, assessing, cold. Clara froze. She knew that face. It was Elias's face, but harder, colder, stripped of the drunken bloat. "Clara," he said. His voice was not warm. It was a flat, educated sound that held no welcome. "It's been a long time." "Amos," she said, her throat dry. I didn't know you were in the territory." "Deputy Marshal Amos Hawthorne," he corrected her, tapping the badge. I'm based out of Prescott now. I was passing through, checking on some family business. The sheriff, a portly man named Blevins, suddenly looked very uncomfortable. Marshal, this here is Clara Hawthorne, Elias's widow. We've met, Amos said, his eyes never leaving her face. He walked toward her, his polished boots silent on the floorboards. You're looking, well, Clara, surviving. I manage, she said, forcing her hands to stay still at her sides. So I see. His gaze flickered to the street, as if he could see all the way back to her ranch. I heard you hired some help. A drifter. The blood drained from Clara's face. The whispers had started. I have a hired hand. Yes, the ranch is too much for one person. Of course, Amos smiled, but it was a thin, cold expression. It's good you're not alone, a woman in your position. It's a dangerous world. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. I was just visiting my brother's grave. It's poorly kept. A sad thing, his passing. Amos continued, his voice a smooth, dangerous current. I was looking at the sheriff's report again, just this morning. A fall in a dry arroyo. Strange? Elias knew that land. He was drunk, they said, but he was always drunk. He never fell. It was an accident, Clara said, her voice shaking. Was it? Amos's cold eyes held hers. The investigation was closed quickly. Too quickly, perhaps. A man with a broken neck and a widow who wasn't precisely grieving. It leaves questions. The law has a long memory, Clara, especially when family is involved. He was threatening her, here, in the middle of the mercantile, with the sheriff listening. He was telling her he could reopen it all. He could drag her through the mud, the whispers, the accusations. I need flour, she mumbled, pushing past him to the counter. Amos watched her, his face impassive. You take care. Clara, I'll be in Red Cienega for a few days. I may ride out to pay my respects to my brother's land. He touched the brim of his hat and walked out, leaving a pocket of icy silence behind him. Clara paid for her flour and salt, her hands trembling so badly she dropped the coins. She fled the store, mounted her horse, and rode hard, the dust stinging her eyes. She found Wade in the barn, sharpening the blade of an axe. He looked up when she entered, and the quiet contentment on his face vanished when he saw hers. Clara, what is it? What happened? He was there, she choked out, sliding off the horse, dumping the sack of flour on the ground. In town, Elias's brother, Amos. Wade went still. Amos Hawthorne. He said the name like he'd tasted something bad. He's a marshal, a deputy marshal. He threatened me. He said Elias's death was convenient, that the investigation was closed too fast. He's going to reopen it. He's going to... Wade! He's going to try and say I killed him. She was pacing the barn, her hands twisting in her skirt. The old panic, the old terror, rising up and choking her. Wade watched her, his face grim. He set the axe down, slowly, deliberately. He ain't here for justice. Clara, Wade said, his voice a low growl. What? How do you know? I've seen men like him, all polished boots and cold eyes. He's wearing a badge. He's got the law on his side, but he ain't here for Elias. Wade walked to the barn door, staring out at the land, at the cabin. Elias is dead. That's done. This is about the ranch. This is about his name. He's here for control. Wade turned back to her, his eyes dark. A man like that, he can't stand to see a woman, his brother's woman, making it on her own. He can't stand that you're surviving. And he really can't stand that you've got another man here. He's not here to investigate Elias. He's here to get rid of you. And me. Clara stared at him. He was right. It wasn't justice. It was family business. It was my brother's land. Amos wanted her gone. He wanted her ruined. The fragile peace of the last few weeks shattered. The cabin was no longer a refuge. It was a trap. The walls were closing in, and she had dragged Wade Coulter inside with her. She looked at him, at his strong hands, at the steady calm in his face. He was a man who had already lost everything to the law. He had a past, a killing. A man like Amos Hawthorne would find that. He would dig it up and use it. He would destroy Wade to get to her. She wouldn't be the one to do that to him. You have to go, she whispered. Wade's head snapped up. What? You have to leave. Now. Tonight. She walked toward him, her hands clenched. You heard what I said. He's a marshal. He'll start digging. He'll find out about Texas. He'll say he'll hang you. Wade, he'll hang you just to prove a point. She was pushing at his chest, her voice cracking. I've brought this on you. I'm like a sickness. Jed Miller, and now this. I ruin everything I touch. You have to go before he finds out you're here. Clara, stop. He grabbed her wrists, his grip firm but not painful. He held her still. No, you don't understand what he'll do. I understand, he said, his voice sharp, cutting through her panic. I understand he's a snake. I understand he's trying to scare you, and I understand you're trying to push me away because you're scared for me. He held her gaze, his own eyes fierce. I told you I'd drift because it's easier, because settling down means judgment. It means facing men like him. I've been running for near on 10 years. Clara, from town to town, job to job, always looking over my shoulder, always alone. His grip on her wrists softened, his thumbs stroking the frantic pulse points. I'm tired of running, he said, his voice dropping, becoming raw, vulnerable. This place, this porch I fixed, this roof, you. This is the first thing in all those years that's felt real, the first thing that's felt like it's worth staying. He let go of one of her wrists and touched her face, his hand rough against her tear-wet cheek. I ain't leaving. I'm not running from him. I'm not running from this. He wants a fight. He'll get one. But I am not leaving you to face him alone. She stared at him, breathless. He was choosing to stay. He was choosing this risk. He was choosing her. That night, the air in the cabin was thick, charged with fear and a desperate, defiant energy. The outside world was coming for them. The law, the whispers, the shame. It was all gathering at their door, embodied by a man with cold eyes and a silver badge. They didn't talk. They moved to the cot, a silent, mutual understanding passing between them. This was not the gentle exploration of their first nights. This was not the quiet comfort. This was raw. It was desperate. Clara clung to him, her kisses hungry, sharp. She was mapping his body, memorizing him, as if he might be torn away at any moment. She was claiming him. Elias had branded her. His touch was a weapon, his desires a punishment. He had used her body to prove her worthlessness, his crude dominance a nightly reminder of her failure. The fear of it, the memory of his cold, heavy hand, was a ghost that still lived in her bones. Tonight she would exorcise it. She trusted Wade. She trusted him with her body, her fear, her past. She pushed him back onto the cot, her hair falling around her face, her eyes dark in the firelight. Clara, he whispered, seeing the strange, wild look on her face. Don't, she said, her voice trembling but firm. Don't speak. Just let me. She guided his hands. She placed them on her hips, her voice a ragged whisper. Elias, he said. She couldn't finish. Instead, she pressed his hands flat against her, her eyes challenging him, challenging the memory. I was always afraid, she whispered. Don't let me be afraid. She was asking for the things that had once terrified her. She was asking him to touch the places Elias had bruised, to reclaim them. She was asking him to take, so she could finally learn what it meant to give freely. Wade understood. He saw the terror in her eyes, warring with a desperate, burning trust. He was not a dominant man. He was a steady one, but he saw what she needed. She didn't need him to be gentle tonight. She needed him to be present. She needed him to be strong enough to hold her fear and transform it. He responded not with dominance, but with a powerful, consuming reverence. He took her, but it was a holy taking. He met her desperation with an intensity that stunned her. His hands were firm, claiming, but they did not bruise. His mouth was demanding, but it did not punish. He held her, pinned her, loved her, not as an object, but as an equal. He took every dark memory, every place Elias had sowed shame, and he replanted it with a fierce, unwavering passion. He showed her that her body was not a source of shame, but a source of power, of pleasure, of life. She sobbed as he moved, the sound not one of pain or grief, but of a final, violent breaking. The last of the ice around her heart, the core of her fear, shattered. Afterward, they lay tangled in the blankets, slick with sweat, the cabin silent save for their ragged breathing. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, painting the room in a soft, red light. Clara lay with her head on his chest, her fingers idly tracing the pucker of the scar on his neck. She was not crying. She was still. She felt scoured clean. Wade's hand stroked her hair, his touch slow, calming. "You ain't broken," he whispered into the darkness. She lifted her head, looking at him. "You never were," he said, his voice thick. "You just needed someone who saw you, all of you, not the widow or the barren wife or the rumors, just you, Clara." The tears came then. She pressed her face back into his chest. But this time, the tears were different. They were not the storm of grief. They were not the sobs of terror. They were quiet. They were warm. They were tears of relief. Tears of a joy so profound it ached. He saw her. He saw all of it, the ugly and the afraid. And he had not run. He had stayed. She cried for the woman she had been, and for the woman she was finally, terrifyingly, becoming. And Wade Coulter just held her, a solid, warm anchor in the dark. The attack came in the dead of night, when the moon was a sliver and the desert was locked in a cold, deep silence. It was the smell that woke Wade first. Not the clean scent of juniper smoke, but the oily, acrid smell of kerosene. He was out of the cot in an instant, pulling on his trousers, his heart hammering with a cold, immediate dread. "Clara," he said, his voice low, urgent. "Get up. Something's wrong." She was awake, her eyes wide in the dark, already reaching for her dress. "What is it?" Smoke. He grabbed his rifle and pulled the cabin door open. The night air hit him, thick with the smell, and he saw it. Flames were licking up the side of the barn. Not an accident, not a stray spark. The fire was climbing the old, dry wood, starting low near the ground, where someone had doused it. "No," Clara breathed, pushing past him onto the porch. "No." "Stay here," Wade commanded. "Lock the door." "The horses! The cow!" She ran toward the fire, grabbing the water bucket from the porch, a useless, desperate gesture. Wade swore, grabbing her arm and shoving her back toward the cabin. "It's too late for the barn. Get inside." He ran to the trough, pumping water frantically, soaking blankets. But the fire had already taken hold. The dry timbers roared, a column of orange and red against the black sky. The heat was intense, pushing him back. He heard the terrified scream of a horse from inside. He aimed his rifle at the sky and fired a shot, hoping to spook the cattle away from the heat, but they were already running. Clara stood on the porch, her hands pressed to her mouth, her face illuminated by the terrible light, tears streaming down her cheeks. The barn, the small repository of their tools, their feed. Her one good milk cow was collapsing into a roaring inferno. Wade ran past the fire, toward the fences. He didn't need daylight to see it. The wires were cut, sliced clean with nippers. He circled the perimeter, his rifle ready, his eyes scanning the darkness. The cattle were gone, scattered into the rocks. He squinted at the ground near the cut wire. Tracks, 2, maybe 3 riders. They had come in quiet, done their work, and vanished. He came back to the cabin just as the barn roof fell in, sending a shower of sparks into the sky. The fire lit the whole yard. He saw Clara, still on the porch, shaking. "They cut the fences," he said, his voice a low, cold rasp. "Drove the cattle off." "All of them?" "Most, I reckon. I'll check at dawn." He looked at the smoking ruins, his jaw tight, his face carved from stone. They burned the horse, and the cow." Clara let out a choked sob and sank onto the porch steps. "One calf," she whispered, her voice hollow. "The one I was nursing, the one with the white face." "I'll check the herd," Wade said, his voice tight. At dawn, the truth was laid bare. The barn was a smoking black rectangle of char. The smell of burned animals hung in the air, a sick, sweet stench. Wade found the tracks. They had pushed the small herd east, toward the rough country. He also found the body of the white-faced calf, its throat cut, left in the dust 20 yards from the broken fence. A message. Not just theft, malice. "They didn't just steal it," Clara said, her voice dead, as she looked at the small, discarded body. "They killed it for spite." Wade's face was grim. "They knew this one was yours, the one you were tending to." "Amos," she breathed. "It has to be." "He didn't do it himself," Wade said, kicking at the tracks. "He hired men, Jed Miller, maybe, men who'd enjoy the work." He looked at the ruined barn, the cut fences, the dead calf. "He's trying to break you, to burn you out." Clara rode into red Cienega, Wade beside her. His rifle was not in its scabbard. It was across his lap. Sheriff Blevins was in his office, boots up on his desk, reading an old newspaper. He looked up when they entered, and his feet hit the floor. "Ms. Hawthorne, Coulter." He looked at Wade's rifle, and his eyes narrowed. "Trouble?" "Trouble you should have stopped," Wade said, his voice low. "Someone burned her barn to the ground last night, cut her fences, stole 8 head of cattle, and slaughtered a calf in her yard." Blevins leaned back, his thumbs hooking in his suspenders. "Now that's a damn shame. Drifters, most like. Or maybe Apache. They get restless." "It wasn't Apache," Clara said, her voice shaking with rage. "It was Amos Hawthorne. He hired those men. He threatened me. I told you." Blevins sighed, picking up a pencil. "Ma'am, that's a heavy accusation. Marshal Hawthorne is a federal officer. He was in here this morning, asking about railroad permits. He ain't the kind to be setting fires." "You didn't see the tracks," Wade cut in. "You didn't smell the kerosene. This wasn't drifters. This was planned. He's trying to run her off her land." "And you'd be the expert on that, Coulter," Blevins said, his voice turning sharp. "I got a wire this morning. About you. Seems you got a history. A killing back in Texas." Clara's blood ran cold. Wade didn't flinch. "Self-defense, cleared by a judge." "That ain't how the wire reads," Blevins said, tapping the desk. "It reads man-killer, drifts, and it's signed by Marshal Amos Hawthorne. He's asking me to keep an eye on you, says you're a vagrant, a threat to the widow." "He's the threat," Clara cried. "Look, ma'am," Blevins said, standing up. "I'm sorry about your barn. I truly am, but I can't go arresting a federal marshal on the word of, well, on your word. There's no proof. You find proof, you bring it to me. Until then, my hands are tied. Now, I suggest you both go on home. And Coulter, I'd watch my step." They rode back in silence, the weight of the injustice settling on them like the dust. The sheriff was turning a blind eye. He was afraid of Amos. The law was not on their side. The law was the enemy. When they reached the ranch, The smoking ruins of the barn greeted them. Clara slid from her horse, walked over to the blackened square, and stood there. Her shoulders slumped. Wade thought she might break. He thought she might finally give up, pack her bags, and let the desert and Amos win. She stood there for a long time. Then she bent down, picked up a charred bucket, and walked to the well. She filled it and poured it over a still smoldering timber. Wade watched her. She went back to the well, filled the bucket again, poured it again and again. He dismounted and walked over to her. He took the bucket from her hand. "Clara, we have to rebuild the fence," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "Before the last cow wanders off?" She turned and walked to the shed, where the spare tools were kept. She pulled out the wire stretchers and a hammer. She looked at Wade, her eyes red, her face streaked with soot, but her jaw was set. He had never seen a strength like it. They stood their ground. They did not run. They began to rebuild. The work was brutal, harder than anything they had done before. They had to clear the char and debris, salvaging what little they could. A few scorched tools, some metal fittings. The smell of the fire clung to them, a constant reminder of the attack. Then they started on the fences. They rode the line, tightening the wire, replacing the posts the riders had knocked down. They worked from sunup to sundown, side by side. The hardship did not break them. It forged them. They worked in a grim, shared silence. Their hands, already calloused, bled. They were exhausted, bone-tired, and running on little more than coffee and fury. But the shared labor drew them closer than any night of passion had. When Clara stumbled, Wade caught her arm. When he missed a strike with the hammer, his hand numb with fatigue, she took the tool from him and finished the nail. They were a team, bound not by vows or law, but by sweat and defiance. A week later, they rode into town. They were out of flour, out of coffee, and they needed more wire than they had. They were a sight, covered in soot and trail dust, their clothes torn, their faces grim. They tied their horses outside the mercantile. Wade stayed on the street, his hand resting near his pistol, his eyes scanning every window, every alley. He would not let her go in alone. Not again. Clara pushed open the door. The store was busy. Mrs. Davies was there, along with two other women from the town council, Mrs. Peck and Mrs. Gable. They were gathered by the fabric bolts, and their conversation stopped dead when Clara entered. She felt their eyes on her, cold and sharp. She heard the whisper. "Look at her, Mrs." Davies said, just loud enough to be heard. "Filthy, like a man." "I heard the marshal, Amos Hawthorne, is investigating her." "Mrs." Peck whispered back. "He believes she killed Elias. And now her barn burns down." "Mrs." Gable added, her voice dripping with implication. "And she shacked up with that killer. It's a judgment. It's what she deserves. A barren woman consorting with filth." Barren. The word hit Clara harder than a fist. It was the word Elias had used. The word the town had used to define her, to dismiss her, to curse her. She had come in for wire. But the rage that had been simmering for a week, the rage from the fire, the dead calf, the sheriff's indifference, all of it boiled over. She turned. She did not raise her voice. She walked directly to the three women. They fell silent, their faces pinched with self-righteousness. "Mrs. Gable," Clara said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden silence of the store. "You call me barren. You've called me that for 6 years. You've whispered it in this store. You've said it in church." The woman sputtered, her face turning red. "Well, it's the truth, isn't it?" "It is a fact," Clara said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. "It is a fact of my body. The way your limp is a fact of yours. The way Mrs. Davies's cruelty is a fact of hers. But you all use it as a weapon. You have used my grief and my pain and my body's failings to judge me." She looked at Mrs. "Davies, you whisper that I'm shacked up. For 6 years, my husband, Amos's sainted brother, put his fists on me. He came home drunk, and he hurt me. And all of you, you looked away. You said it was a wife's duty. You said I provoked him. You saw the bruises on my face, and you said nothing." A silence, thick and shocked, filled the room. "Now," Clara continued, her voice rising, "a man comes to my land. He treats me with kindness. He works beside me. He protects me from men who would hurt me. And that you call a sin. You judge that. You sit here in your clean dresses, and you call me filth." She stepped closer. "My barn is ash. My cattle are gone. A federal marshal is trying to ruin me because he cannot control me. And you are helping him. You are doing his work for him." She held their gazes, one by one. "Shame on you. Shame on all of you for judging a pain you have never felt." No one moved. Mrs. Davies looked as if she'd been slapped. Mrs. Peck was staring at the floor. From the back of the store, a quiet voice spoke. "She's right." It was a young woman, Sarah, a rancher's wife who rarely spoke. She looked at Clara, her eyes full of a pained understanding. "She's right. We all knew about Elias. We all looked away." Clara stared at her, stunned by the support. The door opened. Jed Miller and one of his friends stood there, grinning. They had clearly heard the commotion. "Sounds like the widow's throwing a fit," Jed sneered. "You best be careful. Ms. Hawthorne, Marshal Hawthorne don't like his family name dragged through the mud. He's gonna clean this town up, and he's starting with you and your hired hand killer." Wade stepped into the doorway, filling it. He didn't look at Jed. He looked at Clara. "You got what you need?" he asked, his voice calm. Clara straightened her spine. "Get me the wire. Mr. Davies," she said. She paid for her goods, her head held high, and walked out of the store. Wade followed her, walking backward, his eyes never leaving Jed Miller until the door swung shut. The ride back was tense. The small victory in the store was overshadowed by the open threat. That night, in the cabin, the weight of their situation pressed in. "He won't stop," Wade said, staring into the fire. "Amos, he's using the town now. He'll use Blevins. He'll use Miller. He'll burn the house next. He'll get me thrown in jail. Or he'll get me in a fight he knows I can't win." He stood up, pacing the small room. "We have to leave. Clara, tonight." "Leave?" she said, looking up from the cot. "Leave and go where?" "Anywhere. Oregon, California. I've got a little money saved. We can sell the last cow. We can just go. Start new. Find a place where the name Hawthorne doesn't mean anything. A place where my past can't find us." He knelt in front of her, taking her raw, chapped hands. "I can protect you, Clara. But I can't protect you from a badge. I can't fight the whole town." Clara looked at her hands, then at his face. She saw the genuine fear in his eyes. He was afraid for her. He was offering her the one thing he knew, escape. She pulled her hands free and stood up. She walked to the window, looking out at the black, skeletal silhouette of her burned barn. "No," she said. Wade stood, his face tight with confusion. "No, Clara, they will kill us, or they'll hang me. It's not a choice." "It is a choice," she said, turning to face him. Her voice was quiet, but harder than any steel he had ever seen. "I have been running all my life. I ran from my father's expectations. I ran from Elias's fists, hiding inside myself. I ran from this town's shame. I have lived in fear, and I have lived in hiding. And I am done." She walked to him. "This is my land, my name. He will not chase me off it. That fire, it didn't just burn the barn. Wade, it burned away the last bit of fear I had left. I will not run any more." Wade stared at her. He saw the woman who had cried in his arms, the woman who had trembled at a touch, and she was gone. In her place was this woman, strong, defiant, and magnificent. His fear for her was eclipsed by a deep, powerful admiration. She was braver than he had ever been. He was the one who always ran. She was the one who was teaching him to stand. "They'll come for us," he said, his voice quiet. "Then let them come," she said. He reached out, his hand touching her face. "You're—" He shook his head, a small, rough laugh escaping him. "You're really something. Clara Hawthorne." He didn't argue again. He just kissed her. It was not a kiss of comfort. It was not a kiss of healing. It was a kiss of defiance. It was a claiming. He pulled her against him, his mouth hard on hers. And it was an answer. If we stand, we stand together. Their love-making that night was as fierce and defiant as her words. It was not gentle. It was a physical declaration of war against the world that was trying to tear them apart. It was passionate and raw, a claiming of each other, a sealing of the pact. They were two broken, hunted people, and they were choosing to face the fire together. He loved her with an intensity that bordered on anger at Amos, at the town, at the world that had tried to break her, and she loved him with a desperate, grounding strength, holding him to her, anchoring him to this land, to this fight. The next morning, Wade walked out of the cabin, the sun just rising. He went not to the fence line, but to the old, scarred oak tree that stood near the ruins of the barn, the only thing the fire hadn't touched. Clara watched him from the porch, a mug of coffee in her hands. He took out his pocket knife. He stood before the tree for a long moment. Then, with slow, deliberate strokes, he began to carve. He cut away the rough outer bark, creating a smooth, pale patch. Into this patch, he carved two letters, C-H. He didn't carve his own. He didn't carve a heart. He carved her initials. He stepped back, looking at the mark. He turned to her. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. Once. Clara felt the tears well in her eyes, but they were not tears of fear or sadness. He was telling her, this was her land, her home. He was not here to take it. He was here to defend it. She stood on the porch, watching him walk toward the fence line to start the day's work. She looked at the carved letters and at the smoking ruins of her past. The town had called her barren, a dry well, a useless woman. They thought a woman's future was only measured in the children she could bear. She looked at Wade's back, at the solid, steady way he moved. She felt the strength in her own limbs, the fire in her own heart. Maybe a future wasn't about children. Maybe it wasn't about what she couldn't have. Maybe it was about this land, this fight, this man who had seen all of her, all the broken and ugly parts, and had not only stayed, he had carved her name into the world, permanent and proud. She finally, truly, began to envision a life. Right here. They came 3 days later. The sun was just beginning to burn off the morning chill, and the air was still. Clara was hanging her one good dress on the line, having washed it, letting the dry Arizona air bake the last of the soot from the hem. Wade was near the creek bed, trying to salvage stones for a new foundation. The sound of horses, too many horses, coming too steady, made him drop the rock he was carrying. He looked up, his hand already moving to the pistol at his hip. "Clara," he said, his voice a low command. "Inside, now." She saw them, 4 riders, cresting the ridge. It was Amos Hawthorne, his black coat immaculate, his badge catching the morning sun. Beside him rode Sheriff Blevins, looking miserable. 2 deputies, men Clara did not recognize, flanked them. Clara's heart seized. She ran to the cabin, but not to hide. She grabbed Wade's rifle from its place by the door just as he reached the porch. They stood together on the steps, Wade taking the rifle, his presence a solid wall between her and the riders. Amos pulled his horse to a halt 10 yards away. Blevins and the deputies fanned out, their hands on their holsters. "Clara Hawthorne," Amos called, his voice booming with false authority. "Wade Coulter, you're covered." "You're not welcome here, Amos," Clara said, her voice shaking but clear. "That's Marshall Hawthorne to you," Amos said, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. He unrolled a piece of paper. "I have a warrant, issued this morning by Judge Tobin, for your arrest. Clara Hawthorne." Wade's knuckles whitened on the rifle stock. "Arrest for what? You've burned her barn. You've stolen her stock. Now you come with a warrant?" "I've done no such thing," Amos said smoothly. "My investigation, however, has uncovered new evidence. Evidence regarding the timely death of my brother, Elias." He looked at Clara, his eyes glittering with triumph. "You are under arrest for the murder of your husband by poison." "Poison?" Clara whispered, stunned. That is insane." "We found the tin," Amos said. "Rat poison, half empty, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in your pantry. The same pantry you cleaned out after your hired man arrived." He gestured to Wade. "An accomplice, no doubt. The killer and the widow. It's a tidy story." "That's a lie," Wade growled. "You planted it. You planted it the same night you burned her barn." "Sheriff," Amos said, ignoring Wade. "Do your duty. Arrest the woman." Blevins looked pained. He spat in the dust. "Ma'am, I got to ask you to come along. We're to hold you for the circuit judge." "No," Wade said. The word was flat. "Final." He raised the rifle. Just slightly, the barrel pointing at Amos's chest. "She's not going anywhere. You want her, you come through me." The air crackled. The two deputies drew their guns. "Coulter," Blevins warned, his hand shaking as it went to his own pistol. "Don't be a fool. You can't win this. You'll be dead before you pull the trigger." "He won't be the only one," Wade said, his eyes locked on Amos. "Wade, no!" Clara screamed. She stepped out from behind him, moving directly into the line of fire. She put her hand on the rifle barrel and pushed it down, toward the ground. Wade looked at her, his face a mask of furious confusion. "Clara, get back! I can stop him!" "No," she said, her voice clear, hard. She turned to face the four men, her chin high. She was terrified, but her voice did not waver. "You can't, not this way. You'll die, and they'll still take me, or they'll kill me here and call it justice." She looked past the sheriff, past the guns, and stared directly into Amos Hawthorne's cold, triumphant eyes. "You want to arrest me, Marshall? You want to put me on trial for killing your brother?" She walked down the steps, her boots bare in the dust, until she was standing in the open yard. "Then do it. I am tired of your whispers. I am tired of your threats." She held her hands out, wrists together. "Arrest me. I demand a trial. I demand the truth be told, in front of the whole town. Let them hear it. Let them hear all of it." Amos's smile faltered. This was not the frightened, cowering widow he expected. This was not part of his plan. He had expected a gunfight. He had expected to kill Wade Coulter, claiming self-defense, and drag the widow off in chains. Wade was stunned. He watched her, this woman who had trembled at his touch, now standing down 4 armed men with nothing but her own will. She was magnificent. He lowered the rifle. He walked down the steps and stood beside her. He did not hold his hands out. He just stood there, a silent guardian. "She said she'll go," Wade said to Blevins, his voice rough. "But I'm going with her. I will be at that trial. Every minute. I will be there when you lock her up, and I will be there when you let her out." Amos sneered. He pulled cuffs from his saddlebag and tossed them to the sheriff. "Lock her up." Blevins cuffed her hands in front of her. The metal was cold against her skin. "You'll regret this, Clara," Amos whispered as she passed him to mount the horse one of the deputies brought. You'll wish you'd burned in that fire. And you, she said, looking him in the eye, will wish you had left me alone. The trial was held in the saloon. It was the only building in Red Cienega large enough to hold the crowd. Judge Tobin, the circuit judge, was a weary-looking man with a gray beard and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice. He sat behind the bar, the whiskey bottles cleared away, a gavel in his hand. The room was packed. Every chair, every stool was taken. Men stood 3 deep along the back wall. Clara saw Mrs. Davies and Mrs. Gable in the front row, their face pinched with morbid excitement. She saw Jed Miller near the door, flanked by his friends, and she saw Sarah, the young rancher's wife, standing near the back, her face pale and worried. Clara sat at a small table, her hands uncuffed but folded tightly in her lap. Wade sat behind her. He had not left her side. Sleeping on the floor outside the cell Blevins had put her in, his presence a silent, constant promise. He looked exhausted, his face dark with stubble, his eyes burning with a cold fire. Amos Hawthorne stood opposite them, acting as the prosecution. He was clean, polished, and confident. He had the law, he had the badge, and he had the town's prejudice on his side. "We are here," Amos began, his voice filling the hot, stuffy room, "to seek justice for a good man, my brother, Elias Hawthorne, a man who built a life here, who was struck down in his prime." He walked, pacing in front of the judge. "The defense," he said with a sneer, "would have you believe it was an accident, a drunken fall, but I have evidence that Elias Hawthorne was poisoned, slowly, deliberately, by the one person who stood to gain, his bitter, barren wife." He held up the tin of rat poison. "Found in her pantry, Marshal," he said to the judge. "Hidden, just as her accomplice." He pointed at Wade. "Was hidden." The first day was a parade of Clara's supposed sins. Amos called Mrs. Davies to the stand. "Tell the court," Amos said, "what you observed of the defendant's behavior after her husband's death." Mrs. Davies smoothed her dress, relishing the attention. "She was unnatural, cold. I saw her in the mercantile not 3 days after Elias was buried. She didn't shed a tear, not once. She just bought flour, as if nothing had happened." "And more recently," Amos pressed, "she's been changed. Hard. She came into my store, shouted at myself and other good women of this town, and she's been living in sin with him." She pointed at Wade. "Everyone knows it. A killer and a widow of ill repute. It's a disgrace to my brother's memory." Clara sat still, absorbing the blows. "Do you wish to question the witness?" Judge Tobin asked Clara. Clara stood, her legs shaking. She gripped the edge of the table. "Mrs. Davies, you say I was cold. Did you know my husband?" "Of course. He was a fine man." "Did you ever see him angry?" "Elias had a temper, like any man, but he was a gentleman." "Mrs. Davies," Clara said, her voice clear, "do you recall the 4th of July picnic 6 years ago? Do you recall I left early?" I believe so. You were ill, I think. "And do you recall seeing me in your store or in town for the 2 weeks that followed?" "No, I cannot say I do." "That," Clara said, her voice ringing in the silent room, "is because my husband broke my collarbone for smiling at the blacksmith. I could not dress myself. I could not leave the house. You call him a gentleman. I called him my husband. We clearly knew 2 different men." "Mrs. Davies gasped, her face turning purple. Amos jumped to his feet. "Objection! Slander! She has no proof!" "It is her testimony, Marshal," the judge said, his eyes on Clara. "I'll allow it. Sit down." The tide of whispers in the room shifted, just slightly. Amos, angered, pressed on. He called Jed Miller, who testified he'd seen Coulter buying kerosene. He called Sheriff Blevins, who reluctantly testified that Wade Coulter had a reputation as a killer. Amos was painting a picture, a bitter wife and her new violent lover, poisoning a good man and burning the evidence. The second day, Amos made his fatal mistake. He called the one man he thought was too cowed to speak. "I call Dr. Finley to the stand." Amos announced. Doc Finley, a small man with nervous hands, was sworn in. "Doctor," Amos said, "you were my brother's physician, were you not?" Yes, when he needed me, which was rare. He was a strong man, healthy, no sign of sickness, weakness, dizziness, anything that might make a healthy man fall into an arroyo?" "No," Doc Finley said. "He was vital." "Thank you, Doctor." Amos turned to Clara. "Your witness." Clara stood. She looked at the doctor, not with anger, but with a deep, pleading sadness. "Dr. Finley, you said you rarely saw my husband, but you saw me, did you not?" Doc Finley fidgeted. He looked at Amos, who was staring at him, warning him. You were a patient, yes, ma'am." "How many times, doctor, in the 6 years I was married?" I do not recall." "I recall," Clara said. "It was 5 times. Once, for a fever. What about the other 4 times? Doctor, what were they for?" The doctor licked his lips. The saloon was dead silent. "Tell them," Clara whispered. Doc Finley looked at the floor. You had accidents." "Accidents," Clara repeated. "What kind of accidents?" A broken wrist," he mumbled. "2 cracked ribs, a contusion on your cheekbone and a split lip, and the collarbone you mentioned." "And what did I tell you happened each time?" You said you fell. You said you were clumsy." Clara took a step closer. "And did you believe me, doctor? As a man of science, did you believe me?" Doc Finley looked up. He saw Clara's face, bruised not by fists, but by grief and exhaustion. He saw Amos, his face black with rage. He saw the entire town, waiting. He took a deep breath. "No, ma'am." His voice was suddenly loud, clear. "I did not." The room erupted. "What did you believe, doctor?" Clara pressed. "I believe," Doc Finley said, looking at the judge, "that those injuries were consistent with being beaten, with being struck repeatedly by a closed fist, and the ribs, with being kicked." "Lies," Amos roared. "He's lying. She's bewitched him." "Silence. Marshal." Judge Tobin banged his gavel. "Are you saying, doctor, that you suspected Elias Hawthorne was abusing his wife?" "I did more than suspect, Your Honor," the doctor said, his voice shaking but firm. "I knew, and I did nothing. I told myself it was a domestic matter. God forgive me, I looked away." The whispers were a roar now, of shock, of pity, of dawning shame. Mrs. Davies and Mrs. Gable were pale. They were remembering. The veils, the long sleeves in summer, the illnesses. "I have no more questions," Clara said, and sat down. Amos was ruined, and he knew it. His case was in ashes, but he had one more card to play. Malice. "I call Wade Coulter to the stand," he bellowed. Wade looked at Clara. She nodded. He stood and walked to the front, towering over Amos. He did not take an oath. He just stood there. "You are Wade Coulter, a drifter," Amos spat. "I am." "And is it true that you killed a man in Texas?" "It is." The room gasped. "And now you are living with this woman, on my brother's land, eating his food, sleeping in his—" "Objection," Wade said, his voice a low rumble. The judge raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" "Mr. Coulter," "You're not a lawyer." "On the grounds that he's a damn liar," Wade said.
"And he's asking the wrong questions."
"Then what?" the judge said, leaning forward. "Is the right question?" Wade turned. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at Amos. He looked at the town. He looked at Mrs. Davies, at Jed Miller, at Sarah, at Doc Finley. "He wants to know if I'm a killer," Wade said, his voice passionate, raw, filling the room. "Yes, I killed a man who drew on me. I paid for it. I've been paying for it ever since. I've been running. For 10 years. I've been running from judgment, from names, from men like him." He pointed at Amos. "From men who use the law to break people." He turned his gaze to Clara. His face softened. "I came to this ranch, a broken man, with nothing. I was running. I intended to keep running. And I met her." He looked back at the crowd. "You all see a widow. You see a barren woman. You see a disgrace. You whisper about her. You judge her. You know what I see." He paused, his voice thick with an emotion the town had never witnessed. "I see a woman who has been beaten and starved and shamed. I see a woman who had her land burned, her animals slaughtered. I see a woman who has been treated by this town and by her own husband worse than any dog, and I see a woman who still stands, who still gets up, who still fights, who still has a kindness in her." His voice cracked. "Just once. She saved me. You all think I saved her? This woman saved me. She stopped me from running. She gave me a reason. She gave me a home when all I had was the dust." He looked at Judge Tobin. "I don't know anything about poison, but I know this woman. She is not a killer. She is the strongest person I have ever known, and she deserves peace. She's earned it." He finished. The saloon was so quiet, the only sound was Mrs. Davies, openly weeping. Wade walked back to his chair and sat behind Clara. Judge Tobin looked at Amos Hawthorne. His face was cold granite. "Marshal, you brought me a warrant for poisoning. Your star witness, the doctor, has testified to systematic, brutal abuse. Your other witnesses have testified to town gossip. You have nothing. You have no case. You have only malice." Amos sputtered. "But the poison, the killer." "The only crime I see here," Judge Tobin said, his voice rising, "is the one this town committed against that woman for 6 years. The crime of silence." He banged his gavel. "Case dismissed. The defendant is free to go." He stood. "And Marshal Hawthorne, your behavior, your clear vendetta against your brother's widow, using your badge as a weapon, it is a disgrace. Sheriff Blevins, I want this man escorted to the town line, and if he ever sets foot in this county again, you are to arrest him for harassment. Do you understand me?" Blevins, seeing the whole town turn against Amos, stood up straight for the first time. "Yes, Your Honor, with pleasure." Amos was gray. He was ruined. His reputation, the one thing he cared about, was destroyed. He grabbed his hat, his face twisted in a mask of pure hatred, and shoved his way through the crowd, which parted for him as if he were a leper. Wade stood. He held his hand out to Clara. She looked at it, then up at his face. She placed her trembling hand in his. He gently pulled her to her feet. The town watched them. No one spoke. The silence was not the silence of judgment. It was the silence of awe, of shame, of respect. As they walked toward the door, Sarah, the young woman from the back, stepped forward. She touched Clara's arm. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hawthorne," she whispered. Clara just nodded, her eyes full. Wade and Clara walked out of the saloon, into the bright, blinding sunlight. They walked past their horse. Not stopping, they just walked. They walked out of Red Cienega, leaving the town behind. They walked the 5 miles back to the ranch, his hand holding hers, a warm, solid, calloused anchor. They did not speak, not a single word. The sun beat down on them. The dust rose around their boots. They walked past the burned patch of ground where the calf had been. They walked past the smoking ruins of the barn. They stopped at the old oak tree, the one with her initials, C.H., carved into the bark. They stood there for a long time as the sun began to dip, painting the red rocks in hues of purple and gold. They had won. They had faced the whispers, the law, the fire. They had lost almost everything. But as they stood there, hand in hand, the silence between them was full. They had reclaimed her land. They had reclaimed her honor. They had finally reclaimed her name. The months that followed the trial were quiet. The desert heat of summer settled in, baking the land, but it was a cleansing fire. The silence that fell over the ranch was no longer the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of peace. Amos Hawthorne was gone. The story of the trial had spread through the territory like a tumbleweed, and his reputation was ruined. He had vanished, and with him, the last shadow of Elias. Red Cienega, shamed into awareness, left Clara alone, but the isolation was different now. It was a choice, not a prison. Wade stayed. He never spoke of leaving. The word drifter was a skin he had shed. He was a man who belonged. His days were spent not just mending, but building. The first thing he did was clear the charred ruins of the old barn. He salvaged what iron he could, dug new footings, and, with money saved from his drifting days, he bought new, fresh timber from the sawmill in Prescott. All through the hottest months, the sound of his hammer was the ranch's heartbeat. He worked with a steady, relentless patience, his body lean and hard, dark against the bright sun. Clara worked beside him, hoisting planks, fetching water, holding the beams steady. They were building more than a barn. They were building a home. When it was finished, it stood twice as large as the old one, the scent of fresh pine and sawdust cutting through the dry air. It was solid. It was safe. Wade bought 2 new horses, a steady gelding for work and a young mare. And, to Clara's surprise, he bought a new milk cow, leading it back to the ranch as a quiet offering for the one she had lost. That fall, the first harvest gathering in 7 years was held on the Hawthorne Ranch. Clara had been hesitant.
Wade, I don't know,
she'd said, standing on the new porch he had built.
I don't know if I want those people here.
Not all of them are bad, he'd said, his eyes on the horizon. And the ones that are, well, they won't come. You've earned the right to hold your head up on your own land. Clara, it's time they saw it. She invited Doc Finley. She invited Sheriff Blevins. And she sent a special invitation to Sarah, the young woman who had spoken for her at the trial. They came. It was awkward at first. Blevins, his hat in his hand, stood by the new barn, looking at the fine joinery. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low.
This is a fine structure. A fine structure.
It was the closest he would ever get to an apology, and Clara accepted it, handing him a cup of cider. Doc Finley looked 10 years younger. The weight of his silence lifted. He and Wade talked horses, a quiet respect between them. But it was Sarah who broke the ice. She arrived with her young daughter, Beth, a painfully shy girl of 6 with eyes as wide and frightened as a fawn's. Sarah's husband had been taken by fever 2 months prior, and she was now a widow herself.
Clara,
Sarah said, pressing a warm apple pie into her hands.
I'm so glad you invited us. It's beautiful here.
Mrs. Davies and Mrs. Gable and the other gossipers did not come. No one missed them. The yard filled with the sound of quiet conversation, of neighbors reconnecting. Clara moved among them, her face clear, her spine straight. She was not the outcast. She was the host. She was the survivor. Wade stayed by her side, his presence a solid, unspoken statement. He was her partner. This was their land. The town, finally, saw them. The seasons turned. The harsh winter gave way to a green, vibrant spring. The mare Wade had bought foaled. He called Clara to the barn in the early morning light. The filly was all legs, pale and damp, struggling to stand. "She's yours," Wade said, his voice rough. "You should name her." Clara knelt in the straw, the smell of new life filling her senses. She thought of the calf, slaughtered for spite. She thought of the whispers, the word barren that had been carved into her. She reached out, her hand steady, and stroked the foal's soft nose. "Hope," she whispered. "We'll call her Hope." Wade looked at her, at the light in her eyes, and a rare, slow smile touched his lips. Clara had found her maternal spirit was not lost. It was just waiting. She saw it in Beth, Sarah's quiet daughter. The girl was haunted, afraid of the world, and Clara understood that. She began inviting Beth to the ranch. At first, the girl would just sit on the porch, watching Wade work, but Clara was patient. "Come," she said one afternoon, holding out her hand. "Hope won't hurt you." She started small. She taught Beth how to brush the mare. She taught her how to check a hoof. The girl's small, trembling hands slowly grew confident. One day, Clara lifted her onto the back of the old, steady gelding. Beth gasped, grabbing Clara's shoulders. "I've got you," Clara said, her voice low and soothing. "I won't let you fall." She walked the horse around the yard, her hand on Beth's leg, speaking in a soft cadence. Wade watched from the porch, whittling a piece of wood. He watched Clara's face, the patience, the softness, the profound, gentle strength. He saw the teacher she had been, and the mother she truly was. He saw her healing the girl, and in doing so, healing the deepest, most wounded part of herself. The girl who had been called barren was, in fact, a source of life. She had given him a home. She was giving this child her courage. That night, the heat had broken. A cool breeze blew down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and dust. They sat on the porch, the stars thick and bright in the black sky. They had been silent for a long time, a comfortable, shared quiet that was more intimate than any conversation. "Do you remember that first storm?" Clara asked, her voice soft. Wade nodded, his chair creaking. "I remember. You were standing by the fire, shaking so hard you spilled the coffee." "I was terrified," she admitted, looking out at the darkness. I thought you were just like him. I thought you were just another man who was going to hurt me." "I remember," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I sat on that stool, trying not to move, trying not to breathe wrong. I'd never seen fear like that." "It feels like 100 years ago," she said. She turned, looking at his profile in the starlight. The harsh lines of his face, the scars, they were no longer forbidding. They were familiar. They were beautiful. "I wasn't just afraid of you, Wade. I was afraid of everything, of living, of being touched." He looked at her, his pale eyes catching the starlight. "And now?" "Now," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. His arm came around her instantly, pulling her close. "Now, I feel still. The wind doesn't rattle the walls anymore." He kissed the top of her head. "I fixed the roof." She laughed, a real, soft laugh. "Yes, you did." They sat like that, breathing in the cool night air, the ranch silent and safe around them. The memory of the storm was no longer a ghost. It was just a story, the story of how they began. The warmth of his body, the memory, the deep, profound safety she felt in his arms, stirred something inside her. It was not the desperate need of their first nights. It was not the defiant passion of their fight against Amos. It was a slow, deep, powerful tide of love. They went inside. The cabin was a sanctuary. The old, narrow cot was long gone. In its place was a solid bed frame that Wade had built from the same strong pine as the barn. It didn't creak, it didn't sag. It was a foundation. Wade sat on the edge, pulling off his boots. He was tired from the day's work. Clara watched him, her heart swelling with a feeling so strong it ached. This man, who had come from the dust, had rebuilt her life. He had seen her, all of her, and he had loved her. He looked up, sensing her gaze. "You all right?" She didn't answer with words. She walked to him, kneeling on the floor in front of him. He looked at her, confused, as she took his calloused, scarred hand. She kissed his knuckles, then pressed his palm to her cheek. He saw it in her eyes. The fear was gone. The shame was gone. The desperation was gone. In their place was a woman, whole, confident, and full of a quiet, powerful desire. This was not the frightened woman begging not to be hurt. This was Clara.
"Wade,"
she whispered, her voice husky. It was all she had to say. She rose, and she was the one who led. Her hands, steady and sure, went to the buttons of his shirt. Her touch was not a question. It was a statement. He had taught her to trust her own skin, and now she was showing him the power of that trust. Her movements were slow, deliberate, confident. She undressed him, her eyes never leaving his, her fingers tracing the scars on his neck, his chest. She was not afraid of his past. She was not afraid of her own. When she shed her own dress, she stood before him in the lamplight, not with the trembling vulnerability of before, but with a proud, open honesty. He had seen all of her, and she knew she was worthy. He reached for her, but she stopped him, shaking her head. She was in control. She pushed him back onto the bed, her hair falling around her face. She loved him with a slow, consuming reverence, reclaiming her own body not as a source of pain or duty, but as a source of profound, uninhibited pleasure. This was not two broken halves clinging together. This was two whole souls, forged in fire, finally meeting in peace. She was no longer healing. She was healed. And in her confidence, she gave him the one thing he had never known, a true, unconditional surrender. It was the culmination of every fear faced, every wall broken down. It was trust, made physical. It was love, made real. Dawn was breaking, painting the small window in shades of gray and lavender. They lay tangled, the cool morning air washing over their skin. Clara was nestled against his chest, his heartbeat a slow, steady rhythm beneath her ear. She thought of that first night, of the ragged, painful sobs, the feeling of suffocation, the desperate whisper, "I couldn't breathe." She had been a woman trapped in the wreckage of her past, buried under shame and fear. Wade had been the hand that reached through the rubble. He hadn't just pulled her out. He had taught her how to stand on her own. She lifted her head, looking at his face in the soft light. His eyes were closed, the lines of his face softened in sleep. He was her shelter, her strength. His eyes opened, finding hers instantly, as if he felt her gaze. He said nothing, just looked at her, his expression full of a deep, quiet love. She smiled, a slow, sure smile that reached her eyes. She leaned in, pressing her lips to his. "You gave me breath again," she whispered. They dressed in the quiet comfort of the morning and took their coffee to the porch. They stood side by side, leaning against the rail Wade had built. They looked out at their land. They watched the sun climb over the distant red rocks, a blazing, defiant red gold. The light hit the new barn, turning the pine to honey. It lit the small patch of green where Clara's garden was, finally, stubbornly, growing. The land was still harsh. The desert was still unforgiving. It was a place of scars, and drought, and hard memory, but it was theirs. Clara leaned her head against Wade's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her tight against his side. His hand covered hers on the railing. They stood in silence, watching the day begin. The world washed new and bright. Love, earned through pain, survival, and a raw, unflinching honesty, had bound them. It was a bond deeper than blood, stronger than any law. It was the bond of the reclaimed.
Thank you so much for listening to our story.
We truly hope you enjoyed it.
Where in the world are you listening from? We would love for you to comment and let us know. Please subscribe to From Wild West for more stories just like this one. And be sure to share your thoughts. We love hearing from you.